Mhm. So I'll start. Good morning to everyone and welcome to yet another. This is the eighth ICAP webinar in the series of webinars on emissions trading systems for policy practitioners. My name is Pedro Martins Barata. I'm here with Get to See, one of the members of the consortium. The other members of the consortium that is arranging these webinar series for ICAP and gently funded by the European Commission are Ecologic, who I have to thank for all of the logistics organizing this webinar, and ICF. Today we're going to have the presence of three distinguished experts on aviation emissions and the policy around limiting these emissions. We'll start off with a presentation from Lambert Schneider, who, besides being an old friend, is currently the research coordinator for international climate policy at the Oke Institute, an expert in the international carbon market, and generically on emissions trading. And he has had a recent focus on, or actually not so recent focus on aviation sector and on voluntary offsetting. He's also a member of the executive board of the Clean Development Mechanism. We'll also be joined as discussants by Juan Carlos Arredondo, who's engagement manager at Vivid Economics currently, an international expert also on climate policy, who's been working on long-term planning for low carbon development, NDC planning, previously also as an advisor to the Mexican government and to the World Bank, and working on issues such as GHG accounting, carbon markets, and cooperation under the famous Article 6 or carbon market related article of the Paris Agreement. And last but not least, we will have Pedro Pires Cabezas, who's currently Director of Sustainable International Transport and lead economist at the Environmental Defense Fund. And Pedro's work has also been working around issues of carbon markets and other robust policy frameworks to address emissions from international aviation, including work around sustainable aviation fuels. So this will be by way of introduction to the theme. Just to remind ourselves where we are, this is now 2021. In 2016, a little bit prior to the signing of the Paris Agreement, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, adopted the convoluted name of Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, known as CORSIA, as one instrument to limit the climate impact of international aviation. And this followed on the heels of many, many years of, one can say, and certainly I could because I was present at those negotiations, very fruitless discussions within the framework of the Framework Convention on Climate Change on addressing these international aviation emissions. So part of the theme here today will be to reflect on the work undertaken since the adoption of CORSIA and the role of international aviation emissions in the overall scheme. And then besides CORSIA, and after having done an effectiveness assessment of CORSIA, to discuss what other measures and what else can be done to tackle these international aviation emissions from an emissions trading perspective. And to kick us off on that discussion, we are going to have our usual Mentimeter set of questions. And I'd ask the organization, Jan Erik, if possible, to put up the first question. Along with, in the chat, you will have the instructions on how to join us in this Mentimeter poll. So I hope you are familiarized by now after a few of these sessions on how this works. But essentially, if you follow the link, you'll be able to immediately join into these questions and provide us with answers. What's your opinion on these questions? And we see already for the first question, can carbon pricing really make a difference to reverse the growth in aviation emissions? There's always been a measure of skepticism on the role that carbon pricing can have for tackling aviation emissions. Whether because these are extremely difficult from a technological perspective and high cost to tackle, or because it is seen as a very unwieldy instrument. For whatever reasons, there's been some skepticism, and we'll see. We're seeing now a little bit what with 17 responses coming, what it looks like. A couple more coming in. We'll just wait for a sizable number. Okay, we'll see. There is some idea that it could work to some extent, but if sensible alternatives are provided, such as high-speed rail. So I guess this speaks to the lack of viable alternatives for the type of demand that is there for international aviation services. There's also, as mentioned, some skepticism, and curiously with the social argument that it's mostly the wealthy who fly and they can easily pay the added cost of the carbon price included in the scheme. Okay, so we've had a little bit of that information. It's interesting. Perhaps we can now tackle the second question. So, as mentioned in my introduction, is CORSIA the right tool to tackle aviation emissions? We'll go into details on how CORSIA works, but so the question here would be, what do you feel about CORSIA, and how does it function? Put it this way, how effective will it be in tackling aviation emissions? Okay, we see that seems to be leaning towards the idea that it's either a distraction or a safety net. There's another alternative about it not being perfect. Interestingly, nobody is claiming that CORSIA is most obviously the right tool to tackle aviation emissions. So we're onto something here in terms of the substance of the question. So with this, it looks like, yes, CORSIA is indeed a safety net, but that real progress may come from other types of national regional policies, including obviously, I imagine some role for carbon pricing instruments. But also there is this notion that this could be an actual dangerous distraction from serious policies. On to the third and last of our questions then. What do you see as the biggest issue with CORSIA? There's a word missing there in the title, but let's check for what the audience thinks could be the issue with CORSIA. Okay, looks like a lack of ambition would be one of the issues. The other one being that offsetting, i.e. the idea of compensating emissions with units from other sectors, which is the main instrument under CORSIA, might not be justified if we're heading for global climate neutrality. And then other practical issues with offsets such as additionality, etc. So again, there seems to be a notion that there is something wrong with CORSIA, something, or at least some issue with CORSIA, in terms of both lack of ambition and perhaps the wrong use or the mistaken use of offsetting overall within a framework of carbon neutrality. So this gives us a little bit of flavor for the discussion. Before we go on to the panel, thank you very much for your answers to the questions. Let me just say on behalf of the organization that we're very glad to have these three eminent panelists. We note that we unfortunately could not count at last minute with our one female expert, Miss Alexia Kelly. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us due to a last minute agenda conflict. In any case, we thank all three of the panelists, and obviously also Alexia, even though she unfortunately wasn't able to make it. Let's start off with, I think, Lambert Schneider's presentation. And again, thank you very much, Lambert, for being here. And I think you are now able to skip through your slides. So over to you, Lambert.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Lambert Schneider. Again, I work with Öko-Institut a lot on carbon markets and also on aviation. And I will give a presentation which will give an overview on some of the issues where the Mentimeter questions already have touched upon. Let me see. So what will I cover? I will briefly cover aviation. What is its climate impact? That's a quite complex matter. Then give a picture about the broader view. What are the current carbon prices, taxes, but also exemptions that we have for aviation? Where do we stand with that? Then the instrument which Pedro already mentioned and introduced, CORSIA, is of course a big theme. And the question, what is its impact and how could it be reformed in the future? And then there are a number of emission trading systems which include ETS. And here I will focus on the EU ETS, but also touch upon the others. And what are the key issues at stake in the forthcoming reform of the EU ETS, but also more broadly, when including aviation in an emission trading system, what needs to be considered. So coming to the first theme, aviation's climate impact, I very much like this table. It comes from a very useful site, by the way, offsetguide.org, developed by Stockholm Environment Institute and Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, which gives a good overview of quality issues with carbon credits and what to consider when buying carbon credits. And they have this table, which I find quite useful to understand the different impacts. So we have different climate factors. I think the one which is very well known is CO2, which of course causes warming, and it does so over many centuries, even thousands of years. And it's doing so on a global level, and we have a quite good understanding. So that's a key factor, of course, how aviation is contributing. But then there are all these non-CO2 effects, and they are quite complex because, for example, NOx emissions, they can both increase and decrease ozone, and then they can also help to decrease methane emissions. So you have both warming and cooling effects from NOx emissions. And then you have sulfates, you have soot, and you have contrails and cirrus clouds. And the interesting thing is, the most complex matter maybe is that the time horizon, the duration varies so much. So as I said, for CO2, the CO2 remains in the atmosphere for centuries. ozone and methane can have an effect of weeks to months or decades. But then there are some effects, in particular clouds, who have a warming effect for hours or a few days. And so it's really difficult to compare these climate effects. And also when you consider measures to reduce the non-CO2 effects, there's clearly a trade-off. So for example, airplanes can fly at lower altitudes, which prevents some contrails and cirrus clouds. And so that stops or lowers the immediate warming within the next hours or days. But as the air resistance is larger, it will cause more CO2 in the atmosphere, which will remain there for centuries. So it's a difficult trade-off about some short-term climate effects and some really long-term climate effects. And then the next interesting part of that is that the effects really differ. So in particular for clouds, there are certain weather conditions, and you could fly around these weather conditions where these contrails and cirrus clouds are generated, but then in other regions they are not. And so also the warming effect for CO2, it's global, but for some other effects, it's quite local. And then lastly, the scientific understanding or the uncertainties also vary considerably. We have a very good understanding of the effect of CO2 and a quite fair understanding of some of the other effects, but some are also like indirect cloud effects, for example. The understanding is quite poor, and these effects are also usually not included in these multipliers. There are different multipliers to calculate the non-CO2 effects, and these very uncertain effects are in most cases not even included. So overall, aviation impact is 2.5% of global CO2 emissions. That doesn't sound very much at first, but it's like a quite big country, like Germany, more or less, right? And the important thing is that the total climate impact is about, and there's also uncertainty, of course, around this number, but it's in the order of magnitude 3 times the impact of CO2. So the total impact, including the CO2, is 3 times of only the CO2 impact. And then the last important point to be in mind is that emissions before COVID were on a constant rise despite efficiency improvements in the sector. And so while maybe the sector today has a warming impact of 5 to 10% of the total global warming, if you take the 3 times and the 2.5%, as it's growing and as we are reducing emissions considerably in other sectors, or we are starting to do so, the climate impact, of course, could be much larger, the proportion in 2050 than it's today. Here's also another graph on how aviation emissions these are the emissions from international aviation only, not from domestic aviation, and it's only the CO2 emissions, how they have developed historically from 1970 until to date. And we had various crises, like the oil crisis, the Gulf War, the dot-com crisis, the financial crisis around 2009. And each time there was a kind of recession, and you could see that in aviation emissions. And then it took like 2 to 6 years on average until emissions again reached pre-crisis levels. And then they continued to grow at a similar rate. But each of these crises set back aviation emissions a little bit. And what you can see here, of course, the 2020 is an estimate. It's not yet confirmed data, but it's data estimated based on some data provided by ICAO. You can clearly see it's unprecedented, the decline emissions. It's really, the aviation sector was really hit hard, and it's not comparable to any of the other crises. So emissions in 2020 are probably around more than 60% down from 2019 levels. Then the next theme, and I think this is really important to understand the bigger context for carbon pricing, is where do we stand more generally in terms of energy taxes and other taxes for international aviation. So in particular, in comparison to other sectors more generally, but also to ground transportation in particular. So first of all, value-added tax is exempted from international aviation. And that's alone a quite considerable subsidy for the sector, because it's really, to my knowledge, maybe there are very few other sectors, but it's one of the very few sectors which is exempted from VAT, from value-added tax. For domestic aviation, this depends. For example, in the EU, I think about 22 countries out of the 27, they charge VAT for domestic aviation. Some have reduced tax rates, some have the normal tax rates. And so the monetary impact of that is quite considerable. So if you look at the total of the EU, this is a study from CE Delft. Basically, the tax exemption from value-added tax, it's about 30 billion euro per year. So it's a quite large subsidy, basically, for the aviation sector. Then a similar picture is there for kerosene taxes. So for any other ground transportation, you usually have taxes on gasoline, on diesel, on other fuels. And so also here, international aviation is exempted. By the way, there's a myth or often misunderstanding that the Chicago Convention, which is the basis of ICAO, prohibits this, but it's only that it prohibits to tax something which is within the aviation. But it does not, my legal experts tell me, it's not really that it's not possible to introduce a kerosene tax. For domestic aviation, it's also mostly exempted, but interestingly, there are a few jurisdictions, for example, also states in the US, who have some low taxes on kerosene. That's for the EU context, as an example, another subsidy, one could say, in the similar magnitude of the value-added tax, which the sector is not paying. Then we have the carbon pricing instruments, in particular CORSIA, which is applicable to international aviation and not to domestic aviation. And here we do not know yet what the prices in 10 years will be, but I haven't provided here a cost estimate, but the costs for the aviation sector will likely be very, very low. So currently the prices are at about $1 per ton of eligible carbon credit for CORSIA. And it's only a certain fraction of the emissions which need to be offset. So this will be, I would say, far below 1 billion per year. And it could be few millions in the beginning. So it's a completely different order of magnitude what airlines will have to pay compared to the subsidies and taxes they enjoy. And then we have an instrument which has a much higher carbon price, which is emission trading systems. We have them in various countries, in Switzerland, the EU, in South Korea, New Zealand, UK. They all include domestic aviation in some form. Also China. I'm not sure whether this has been implemented. I couldn't find information about that. But there are also some pilot schemes, and it's planned, at least for the national scheme, to include aviation at some point in the future. And so here, even if you take an allowance price of about 50 euro, where in the EU, where it has currently risen to, the total cost that airlines would have to pay at 50 euro under the current rules, it's about 1.5 billion euro. And that's, of course, much, much more than if you consider the prices for CORSIA. But also, it's relatively small, again, compared to the kerosene tax exemption and the value-added tax exemption. Then an interesting development is that over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, more and more countries have introduced ticket taxes. And these ticket taxes sometimes depend on how far you fly, and sometimes on business or economy class. There are even few countries who have taxes on freight transportation, very low levels. And so this is kind of another tax which is charged on aviation. And for example, in Germany, we have ticket taxes which have a volume of around 1.75 billion euro. So I think, and one could see these taxes kind of part of the bigger question of how aviation is priced. And I think maybe it's a bit a dramatic analogy, but I think you can see here that the carbon pricing or the ticket taxes, all these instruments which we have in place, they are quite low compared to the subsidies that the sector enjoys. And it's similar, like if you take the example of coal-fired power plants, like if you continue to have a lot of subsidies for coal-fired power plants and then you introduce a small CO2 price, it probably will not do really the job. So I think part of the bigger picture is not only pricing aviation, but also ending the subsidies that aviation is joining, because if you price a little bit with carbon, but if you have a lot of subsidies, the carbon pricing is not actually really effective. Okay. So coming to one of the key instruments, CORSIA. So what is CORSIA about? The goal, as Pedro, I think, already has put it, is carbon neutral growth, meaning that airlines must offset the increase of emissions beyond the 2019-2020 baseline by purchasing carbon credits. Below you see basically they can address these emissions in different ways. Carbon credits is the main tool, but of course they can implement operational and technical improvements such as flying more efficient airplanes. They can use sustainable aviation fuels. That's maybe something Pedro will also touch upon. And then there's the use of carbon credits. It's only applicable to international flights, not to domestic flights. It's only addressing CO2. That's important because as we know, the climate impact is about 3 times the CO2. And it uses a route-based approach that's to avoid competitive issues. So all the routes between state pairs participating in the scheme are included. So if, for example, the United States and France participate, then all flights between France and the United States will be part of the scheme. If a country, Russia, does not participate, the flights between France and Russia will not be part of the scheme. There's a voluntary phase from 2021 to 2026, and the coverage of international aviation is approximately 50% in that phase. These numbers change, of course, with countries joining or leaving. And then there's a mandatory phase as of 2027. And if that's being implemented, it could cover about 80% of international CO2 emissions from aviation. It was adopted in 2016 by the International Civil Aviation Organization. And then over the last years, there was a detailed rule package negotiated and being adopted, for example, on rules for sustainable aviation fuels, rules which carbon offset credits can be used, how emissions need to be reported, and so on. So here's again a picture illustrating how it works, what the original plan was. So the assumption, the reference scenario in green is that the emissions would continue to rise. And then there's in blue this goal of carbon neutral growth, and any difference between the rise in emissions and the goal that constitutes the offsetting requirements. Or alternatively, of course, airlines can reduce their emissions through the sustainable aviation fuels or technical and operational improvements. And then what happened is that COVID-19 came in place. And so here you see a scenario. The actual scenario may even look a little bit more drastic. There are lots of different scenarios. We tried to construct one. So you see again the green reference scenario and then the red COVID scenario. This is how emissions may develop. A key question is how quickly will emissions bump up again? And there was a lot of discussion also under ICAO about that in different fora. But it seems quite clear that emissions may never bounce back to the reference scenario. And that we could see from previous crises that this happened, but it's also possible, for example, that the whole digitization, digital meetings will reduce business travel, etc. So there's a quite good likelihood that, of course, emissions will return to grow, and we may have some high growth years over the next years when people want to go on holiday again, etc. But it's quite clear from the scenarios that they will not just bounce back to what was expected before the COVID crisis. And so what ICAO did is when COVID came into place last year, they changed the original baseline, which was the average of 2019 and 2020. And of course, in 2020, we have very low emissions. So they changed that to a 2019 baseline, at least for the first phase from 2022 to 2023. For future phases, this still needs to be decided. And so what you see here is that with the 2019 baseline, which is now the blue line, basically there's no need for doing any climate action because emissions have reduced anyways. And so no climate action is actually triggered or necessary under CORSIA. And this could be for a couple of years. It's quite certain that for the next, until in the first phase, there will be no demand or practically no demand for carbon offset credits, probably no demand actually. And then there could be a small demand, but only in the last phase of the scheme if the 2019 baseline would be retained. And so this change from a 2019-2020 average to a 2019 kind of reduced the offsetting requirements or the true climate action, like not just the business as usual emission reductions or business as usual, the COVID emission reductions, but emission reductions beyond that, the need reduced it tremendously. And so there will be very few offsetting requirements that will be necessary. And the interesting part is, according to our calculation, if ICAO wouldn't have changed the original baseline, like if it would have left the average of 2019-2020 emissions, then the baseline would have been the dotted blue line. And you can see that between the dotted blue line and the red line, the difference is not very large to the original offsetting requirement, which is between the blue line and the green line. So, I mean, we don't know how quickly emissions will rebound, but there was a good chance that the offsetting requirements actually would have been not so much affected as one might think at a first glance. CORSIA, as we have seen from the Mentimeter question, also has a number of other challenges. There's clearly this question of overall ambition. I think that was also rated highest in the Mentimeter question. And that relates to the goal, like generally the goal of carbon neutral growth is not aligned with the Paris Agreement. So if all sectors should contribute, clearly this goal should be more ambitious. And what I find quite interesting is that in recent years, we have seen so many airlines and airline associations already pledging net zero emissions by 2050, sometimes earlier, and making even pledges not to do that through offsetting, but to a large extent or to a significant extent through measures within the sector. And so it seems that ICAO is kind of the least common denominator, or at least it's much in ambition, it's way weaker than what most airlines are already pledging voluntarily. Some airlines are already now offsetting all the emissions, all the CO2 emissions that their travel causes. And so that would be basically a zero emissions goal, right? And then using offsetting to compensate for the emissions. A zero emissions goal by now, not by 2050, right? A net zero goal, of course. And then there's the issue with the coverage. The main issue is it covers only CO2, and it has a limited coverage until 2026 at least. And so it addresses less of 20% of aviation's climate impact is covered by the scheme because of that. And then the issue of the 2019 baseline, which I just explained. I think there are several debates around CORSIA, but I would say the second biggest debate is about the quality of the eligible carbon credits. The first issue is that in the first phase, a decision was taken that credits from projects with a crediting period start date of 2016 are eligible. So this means that already implemented and existing projects are eligible under the scheme. And in many instances, depending also on the market, whether the market is oversupplied or not, but in most instances, this does not trigger any new emission reductions, right? Because many of these projects operate in a market that is completely oversupplied, that is stranded, one could say, and they are not able to sell their credits, right? At least under the CDM, that's the case. And so if they now have an opportunity to sell some credits to CORSIA, and otherwise they wouldn't have been able to sell these credits, that doesn't have any climate impact. I think the intent is clearly for the second phase to update these vintage eligibility criteria, but so far that's the criteria that we have. Then we have additionality. So we have lots of projects with questionably additionality, which are included. So basically there was no exclusion of any project types based on additionality grounds. But if you look to what's going on in the market, there are lots of initiatives like the task force initiated by Mark Carney, where there's thinking, okay, how can we move to more quality? But that didn't happen under CORSIA or ICAO. What I also found quite astonishing is that at some point, it was clarified under ICAO that non-permanence only needs to be addressed during the duration of CORSIA, so until the end of the 2030s. And so this means if you do an afforestation project and it's burned or cut down in 2040, that's not of interest to CORSIA. But of course, that doesn't help, that alleviates from short-term warming, but it doesn't help to achieve the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, because the CO2 will remain in the atmosphere for quite some time. There's also been lots of debate about how to avoid double counting. Rules to avoid double counting have been actually established under CORSIA. The principles are all there. I think the key matter lies now with parties under the UNFCCC, because it requires implementation of Article 6 rules and implementation of these rules to make it really operational, so that double counting is really avoided. So this is also a little bit uncertain at the moment, but mostly because of the lack of progress under Article 6 negotiations under the Paris Agreement. So overall, it's, I think, fair to say that at least in the initial phases, there will be no or very little climate mitigation coming from CORSIA. In the EU impact assessment, there are some estimates that even if the carbon credits would all be very high quality and all represent 1 ton of CO2, the impact on climate mitigation could be quite limited in 2025, very limited in 2025, and moderate, I would say, in 2035. And as a result of these matters of the eligibility of old projects, etc., also the prices are low. They are around, there are few trades, but it seems they are around $1 US per ton of carbon credit. So with this, I come to the last theme, which is emission trading systems. Aviation has been included in a number of ETS, and most importantly, there's an upcoming review of the EU ETS to align the EU ETS with the new 55% reduction target of the EU. So in the EU ETS, currently the cap for the aviation sector is 5% below 25 levels in 2020, and then it's decreasing to 27% below 25. And that will now be probably revisited as the whole ETS is being revisited. There's also a discussion about auctioning versus free allocation. So currently 15% of the allowances in the aviation sector are auctioned and 85% are allocated for free. In total, this means that the aviation sector needs to pay for 50% of its emissions because this 15% and 85 relates to 2005 to the base year. But what is under discussion is to move to 100% auctioning because the sector, due to the route-based approach, there's not or just a very limited risk of carbon leakage. And then maybe the biggest discussion relates to the scope in relation to CORSIA. That's an issue for each ETS to consider, but it's particularly an issue for the EU ETS. So there are lots of options on the table. One is a clear cut, so that the ETS only applies to domestic flights and CORSIA for international flights. But then the question in the EU context, of course, is what is a domestic flight? Is a domestic flight only a flight within Germany as defined by CORSIA, or would the EU say, well, inner European flights are domestic flights, and so CORSIA would only be applied to flights from EU or EEA countries, to be precise, to non-EU countries. And so these are options, but then there are also various hybrid options being discussed where both would apply ETS and CORSIA in various ways. And of course, there's still on the table the original scope of the ETS, which was global, and so that CORSIA wouldn't be applied at all, although this may be unlikely, but it's still one of the options on the table that the ETS would apply to all international flights. Conclusions, I tried to keep it looking to the time to keep it a bit short. So I think, first of all, it's really important that we address aviation matters. There has been the COVID crisis, but generally emissions have been grown significantly, and the climate impact in 2050 could be quite large if emissions in this sector are not addressed. What's also important to bear in mind, that's its long-living capital stock. So the aviation planes, they operate for 20 or more years, and also transforming the sector, establishing the infrastructure for alternative fuels, that really needs time. And so it's really important that we have early incentive and considerable incentive to embark on a transformation towards net zero or zero emissions, not net zero emissions, towards zero emissions within the sector. So to think from a long-term perspective and to build up the technologies and pathways which lead there. And I think the industry itself, it's already engaging a lot towards that. There's a lot of interest in alternative fuels. A lot is going on. New aviation types are being developed by the big, by Airbus and Boeing, etc. And then the key message, which I already gave, is I think putting a price on carbon is only effective if we also address the tax exemptions which are there. And I think one idea which we recently brought up in a study is that because it's difficult to introduce VAT taxes, right? Because it's international flights, it's difficult to negotiate that. But an alternative is to introduce ticket taxes, which are set at a level that they more or less compensate for the lack of VAT. And so we calculated that for Germany, for Europe, it would mean a ticket tax of about 50 euro for a short distance economy trip and 150 to 20 euro for long distance trips, and then even higher prices for business class. And that could be a way to introduce these ticket taxes to address the lack of VAT. And then I think something also considered in the EU, because there will be also a reform on the energy taxes, is to abandon a tax exemption on kerosene and to introduce the minimum tax. I think it's about 33 euro cent per liter of kerosene. Then what can do carbon pricing instruments do? So I think inclusion in ETS is really a good way forward. Full auctioning is also setting more incentives. And I think one thing to consider, and the EU has a mandate since a long time to consider, is how we can address the non-CO2 effects in the longer term. And there are also different options on the table. So I think a first step towards that would be to establish monitoring requirements. So to establish systems to monitor what the non-CO2 effects of flights are. And then maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, we can consider how to include these effects in ETS. I think CORSIA needs substantial reform to be effective. The goal needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Also, in the longer term, it must address non-CO2 effects. Otherwise, it's always very, very limited. And it's important to be in mind that some of the alternative, like sustainable aviation fuels, for example, they can address to some extent the non-CO2 effects, but not fully, right? And then I think a good route forward would be to adopt an in-sector goal and measures. One could still use offsetting, but to think about, okay, how can we reduce, include measures, incentives like blending mandates for alternative fuels to drive in-sector emission reductions. I think key would be also a reform of the emissions unit eligibility criteria. These are the criteria for what type of carbon credits are eligible, and to move to high quality carbon credits. And very last point, I think if we really want to transform the sector, it's important. Carbon pricing can play a role, but it's clearly not sufficient. So I think there's also a lot of research and development and incentive schemes needed. We need for short-term distance flights, electrification, new propulsion options, new body designs, etc. And there could also be a varying types of instruments to use alternative fuels, in particular e-fuels, so power to liquid, fuels made out of CO2 captured from the atmosphere and hydrogen, for example, or using hydrogen directly. And this is really expensive, but this is kind of the long-term pathway that we need. And so there are different other policy instruments like contracts for difference or blending quotas, which could be used to promote that. And I think carbon markets will not promote this development, because even with ETS, the prices will be too low, because these are really expensive options. But given that it takes time to bring them in the market, I think it's important to have these complementary policies in place. Yeah, thank you very much. And here are a few recent publications which are related to the topic.
So thank you, Lambert, for a very, very comprehensive presentation. We're just realizing amongst the organization that you've been even acclaimed in the chat box for the quality of the presentation, and myself have learned and have already a few questions lined up. I would just want to, before I give over to Juan Carlos, a couple of points. One is we're still waiting for your chat questions in the chat box. You use the Q&A function there, and please send us your the questions through the Q&A function. So sorry again, my mistake, not the chat, but the Q&A question, and specifically address your question to one of the speakers or to exactly who you want to address the question to. Next, we have Juan Carlos. As I mentioned in the presentation, he's currently with Vivid Economics, therefore based in London. I met Juan Carlos when still in a Mexican hat, put it this way, a sombrero rather than a bowler hat in London. And just before handing over to him, let me go down memory lane to emphasize one of the issues of the politics of aviation emissions has always been the very difficult nature of these being international emissions. So the allocation between countries has always been an issue. And within the UNFCCC, the standard, almost, I would say, argument for not having these under the UNFCCC, and quite a reasonable one, would be that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has a founding principle on common but differentiated responsibilities, which implies that developed countries must or should take the lead in tackling these emissions. Ergo, all of this convoluted history of how these emissions are somewhat different from everything else that we are doing in the climate policy arena. So with these remarks and noting that the presentation is up, over to you, Juan Carlos. And thank you very much again for coming to our panel and being a member.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you very much, ICAP, and everyone for the invitation, and of course for attending. What I want to share with you today is a few remarks about the perspective of a policymaker. No? The aviation industry, as we have heard from Dr. Schneider, is an economic activity, something that takes place within a country, but also in between countries. And the challenge is, how do you, as a policymaker, regulate or control or limit the emissions of the aviation industry? So what is important to understand then is, I would say, the fundamentals of this. No? This is something that every single policymaker should know, but it's not always the case, particularly in developing countries. And sorry if I am being too harsh on this assertion. So what drives emissions in the aviation industry? And Dr. Schneider already highlighted some of this. So this is just a compilation in a different simple or simplistic even manner. One, of course, is the aircraft, the characteristics of the aircraft in terms of the energy consumption and the type of efficiency that an aircraft may have. And also the type of energy source that the aircraft may use. If it's a fossil fuel of some sort, if it's sustainable aviation fuel in some mix, if it's hydrogen into the future, or if it's an electric type of energy source. But all of these, the characteristics of the aircraft, they come from the design. So once you have designed and have put out for sale into the market an aircraft, whatever the company, somehow you have already conditioned the type of emissions that you may get from the use of such aircraft. And that's something that policymakers may not have a role in or a say into the definition of this. Of course, there may be regulations associated to the aviation industry in different countries, but it's quite difficult for a single country to regulate all of the aspects of the design of an aircraft. Of course, the emissions will come from the operations, and the operations, we can see that from three different perspectives. Is just a sample of it. It's not comprehensive, but we can think in terms of the routes served by the airlines. So how far they go, if they fly from Europe to Asia or just within a specific region. So what are the business models of the airlines? And of course, depending on the route served and the choice of aircraft, you will have certain level of emissions. The flight conditions, the weather conditions in a specific route, in a specific flight will determine to some extent for that specific flight, how much more emissions you may have just from the fact that you may have to accelerate, you have to increase your altitude, you have to decrease the altitude, you have to speed up a little bit, you will be against the winds, something that will somehow affect the specific emissions of that flight. But also the other component of these emissions may come from the ground operations. How long you have your engine on during your taxiing operations in an airport, how long it takes for you to land, how long it takes for you to take off. And once you are there, how much you can rely on the local energy sources, sort of saying, for you to turn off your engine and reduce the level of emissions of an aircraft. And of course, it's dependent to a number of things, including the infrastructure or even the regulations that exist. And then in addition, of course, we have the traveler's preferences. So people may want to travel more or less with more frequency, farthest, from Asia to Europe, or within Europe, or within the United States, or from United States to Cancun or Brazil or somewhere else. And of course, that's up to the travelers to decide. So it's not part of the definitions of an emissions trading system or for a carbon market. However, the travelers are now a little bit with the option of the offsetting of their flights. No? There is some history there, but that's the only option that exists in this moment for the travelers, other than deciding where they want to go and how far they want to go. And of course, what options they have to go where they want to go. If they have the option of just flying because it's a transatlantic flight, or if they have the option of terrestrial or maritime traveling according to their needs. So of course, most of the emissions are coming from the operations triggered by the travelers' preferences, the decisions of the airlines in terms of the routes and the infrastructure that exists for the operations, but all, of course, conditioned by the design options for the aircraft. So from a policymaker perspective, how do you bring aviation industry into an ETS or into some sort of policy that allows you to limit and reduce the emissions over time? So the first and foremost piece of information that you need as a policymaker is information about the fuel type, the consumption, and the level of emissions. You may have that per aircraft type, you may have that per route, you may have that with a certain frequency, but what is important is whether or not in your jurisdiction you have a reporting obligation for the airlines, for the aviation industry operating in the country. And of course, in that, it's important to differentiate in between the domestic operations and the international operations, because it is at that point when you can start to see how much you can really be in control within your jurisdiction if it's domestic, or how much addressing aviation emissions will be more on the side of ICAO or the international discussions. So for policymakers, part of the decisions have to do with establishing the reporting obligations. What is the regulatory basis, the content, frequency, and process to be followed for the reporting? And of course, what are the obligations in relation to verified reports, so that you have accurate, transparent reports, well represented in terms of they are truly giving you a good picture of the level of emissions of the airlines in your country. And also then policymakers, what they have to do is to decide for themselves as country, not for themselves as persons, but as country, what is the acceptable level of emissions for the country. And this has to do with the level of ambition that the country may have. What is the emissions level that it's needed, or where the country wants to be according to its own policies and its own targets, according to the Paris Agreement or according to the domestic regulations? What is the trajectory that they may want to have in terms of the level of emissions for the country and from the different emission sources that exist in that country? And also, what are the economic implications of such decisions? If you are more stringent and if you're more ambitious in terms of your emission reduction target as country, and if that will be borne by some specific economic activities, including aviation, or if it's something that can only be solved by way of setting some of that, for instance. And in that context, an important decision for a policymaker is how an emissions trading system may help you as a country to reduce your emissions. And this is exactly at this moment where the discussions about the aviation industry match or fit into the national discussions of what is an acceptable level of emissions. Because it is to the policymaker to decide the design considerations of an ETS. What is the target? What is the scope? What is the average? What are the emissions thresholds that define if a participant or a company should participate in the emissions trading system or not? How much allowances you are going to create to allow companies participating to emit up to a certain level, and how you are going to allocate such allowances. If you will allow for offset emission reductions coming from other places, other sector, other sources not regulated by the ETS, to become an option for the participants in an ETS. And of course, how in this process you define how frequently you will review the operation of your system and how and what you may want to update in your emissions trading system. So as a policymaker, all of this is part of what you need to know about the aviation industry, and of course, how you may take that into consideration when you put forward this national discussion of having a carbon market in the country, an emission trading system in the country, for instance, or even if you decide to go for a carbon tax. Usually, what happens with the aviation industry in terms of the options for the travelers for offsetting their flights, what happens for those who participate in voluntary carbon markets, what happens for those who are now somehow associated to CORSIA is where the emission reductions are coming from. What are those mitigation outcomes that may be used for different uses? So what we know and what is I would say the traditional way of understanding this is that there may be a mitigation activity or project hosted in some jurisdiction in a specific sector, regulated or not, it will depend. But if it's not regulated by an ETS and it's outside of such regulation, then your mitigation project may be registered with some type of standard or emission reduction program that will tell you what are the considerations or requirements that you need to fulfill if you want to create an emission reduction or a mitigation outcome that may be verified or certified and that suddenly may be sold to someone for a specific use. So that's how voluntary markets work in its essence. And what policymakers are facing at this point in time with all this variety of mitigation options, with this variety of standards and emission reduction programs, this variety of emission reduction units, from the CDM, from VERA, from the gold standard, and now from CORSIA or for CORSIA, is what is the potential use of those mitigation outcomes. And these competing uses is what is becoming an emerging challenge for policymakers, because they may not fully understand how all of this connects, where all of this originates, and how at some point their own decisions in terms of how to reduce the emissions in the country may affect or not different industries based on their decisions to use an outcome there or not. So for instance, what we are seeing right now is that the mitigation outcomes or the verified reduction units may become an asset for the financial sector. So a carbon asset that may be bought, retained, and sold whenever it's convenient, but not for the purposes of mitigation, but just because it may have an economic value. It's a financial instrument. And that's something that is already happening and with some level of success in the financial industry. At the same time, and as highlighted by Dr. Schneider, we are seeing different corporations from different parts of the world in different economic activities claiming that they are contributing to the fight on climate change, claiming to be carbon neutral, claiming to adopting some type of net zero target. And in some of those claims, what it's underneath or the underlying assumption somehow is that in addition to whatever type of reductions they may have in their core operations or in the value chain of those corporations, is that they may want to compensate, offset, neutralize, remove emissions. Basically, that they want to use offsets for the purpose of achieving these claims that they are putting forward. So one of the options for those mitigation outcomes is that they go into the option of the corporate claims. At the same time, countries are facing the challenge of achieving their national targets as part of their NDCs, and also in potentially engaging into cooperation across jurisdictions for them to help themselves achieve their targets and also achieve or reach a higher level of ambition in terms of mitigation, according to the Paris Agreement. And one of the options is precisely to use the same type of mitigation activities or the same type of mitigation outcomes for the purposes of demonstrating compliance with the NDC or for the purposes of potentially allowing the transferal of those outcomes to another jurisdiction for that other jurisdiction to use that for their own NDC. That's part of the Article 6 cooperation, and the rules are still under definition. Also, the policymaker may be facing the challenge of making a decision in its design of its ETS of allowing offsets generated in the country or potentially offsets generated elsewhere for those offsets to be used for those participants in the market to achieve their or to comply with their obligations or achieve the level of emissions imposed upon them. And now the new option or the emerging option is the potential use of those outcomes as eligible emission reduction units for CORSIA. And this is where, sorry, not emissions, but aviation industry comes into place. And this is where governments and policymakers and the aviation industry may start to interact. But for governments and policymakers, some of the challenges are responding on how to avoid the double counting and the double claiming of these mitigation outcomes, of these emission reductions, and what could be potentially the best or most efficient use of the mitigation outcomes happening or taking place in their own country. If they will allow that for Article 6 cooperation, for other countries to account this for their own NDCs, if they will allow some of these for their own ETS, if they will acknowledge that this could be used by corporations for their own claims, or if they allow and they are aware that these will be used by the aviation industry for CORSIA. So precisely because of that, it is important for policymakers and I guess for the general public to have a better sense of how CORSIA works. So there are three components in the operation of CORSIA. One is the emission reduction programs, two is the governments, and three is the airlines. So the programs are the ones who apply for eligibility to CORSIA. They send their application to ICAO, trying to get themselves accepted as eligible programs and their emission reduction units to be eligible units, for them to become somehow a supplier of CORSIA units for the aviation sector. So they are the ones who submit an application once the call for applications is open on the side of ICAO. On the side of the governments, what they have to do under CORSIA is to calculate the offset requirements, depending on the level of emissions coming from the aviation industry. The aggregation of that is precisely what Dr. Schneider presented, that governments, by way of collecting that information domestically and submitting that information to ICAO may know what is the global level of emissions, and from those participating countries in the voluntary phase or later on the compulsory phase of CORSIA, to know what is the level of emissions, what is the baseline, and what is the difference, and how many offsets may be needed for the compensation of that emissions growth over time. And finally, it is up to the airlines on one side to report their verified emissions. That's part of their interaction with the governments, and before those emissions or that information reaches ICAO. And then for the airlines to purchase eligible emission reduction units. And once they have that and they know how much they have to surrender, how much they have to demonstrate in terms of compensation, that they cancel those units in the registry of the standard or system that is eligible for CORSIA. So in short, for airlines to demonstrate CORSIA compliance, what they have to do is to cancel eligible units, CORSIA eligible units. So they have to demonstrate they have compensated their emissions through the acquisition and cancellation of emission reduction units. It is only units that are CORSIA eligible once they have gone through an assessment process with ICAO. The CORSIA eligibility of units only comes from the assessment of those programs that have applied to be considered as eligible. And if they succeed, then they will be the ones who generate emission reduction units eligible for CORSIA. And this assessment in the universe of ICAO is conducted by the Technical Advisory Board, by the TAB, who has the mandate to assess the eligibility of these programs who apply, and also to present the recommendations to the ICAO's council, for the ICAO's council to make decisions on what becomes eligible under CORSIA. And finally, which is part of the discussion here, is what is assessed by the TAF. Because as has been mentioned, well, there are plenty of questions and doubts about the eligibility of some projects or the characteristics and quality attributes of some activities and of some emission reduction units. But what we should remember and not forget is what the TAB assesses is once someone applies, they have to provide information and evidence for that information in terms of how their emission reduction program, their standard, is designed, and what characteristics are associated to the reductions or verified units that they issue as program. So it's not an assessment of a specific projects. It's not an assessment of a specific methodologies for specific sectors. It's not an assessment of a specific cost, but it's an assessment of how an emission reduction program is conformed, how it is set up, how it operates, all of the framework for this, and to demonstrate that they operate in such a way that they can ensure some quality attributes for the emission reduction units, and for the emission reduction units to comply to certain criteria that can give us to some level of certainty that they are of high integrity or the high level of quality. One of the components on this is that programs must demonstrate that they have some type of interaction or contact with the governments, which is precisely to address and potentially avoid that risk of double counting and double use and double claiming of emission reduction units. So with this, I will close my presentation here just to allow for more time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And I noticed as you were speaking that I failed to mention two things of your biography. One is that you're a doctor yourself. So it's not only Dr. Lambert Schneider, but Dr. Juan Carlos Arredondo. And the second one is that, as you mentioned the TAB, I failed to mention that you are in fact a member of the TAB currently, if I understand correctly. So we do have the right person here to tell us about what the competencies of the TAB and the CORSIA are. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Pedro Pires Cabezas, who will discuss, yes, CORSIA, but other things related to aviation emissions and markets. You don't have, I believe you do not have a presentation, but go ahead, Pedro, and namesake.
Thank you, Pedro. It's kind of curious that there are two Pedros on the call and they both are sitting on the same kind of chair. So and that's lovely. So thank you for the kind invitation, and thank you all for attending the event. Such a great, I mean, such a wonderful privilege also to be able to take the floor after the interventions of Dr. Schneider and my dear friend Juan Carlos Arredondo, that I haven't seen for a while. Last time was in Mexico City, sorry. You changed the name. But it's such a great pleasure. So as Pedro mentioned, I'm going to try to change a little bit gears, make the connection between everything that has been said till now, and try to provide you with an alternative illustration of how markets are playing a role in decarbonizing aviation. And it's interesting because the connection with CORSIA is very, very strong, as you will see. Before I jump into that, I want to flag a couple of things. Full disclosure too, I've been engaged in ICAO negotiations, deep in the kitchen of ICAO, all the technical groups and all the small groups defining lots of little details of the regulation since 2013. So I try to keep it like the burden of the of the technical knowledge to keep it aside. But if you have any question after my intervention or afterwards, I'd be happy to fill you up with the bytes that might be useful to understand some of the elements. So why I bring up 2013? Because 2013 is the moment when ICAO agreed on the current level of ambition for CORSIA. So the carbon neutral growth was adopted in the General Assembly of ICAO that meets every 3 years, and that was in 2013. So we kind of put that into context, and we kind of put that in context also of how the Paris negotiations or the UNFCCC negotiations at the time were unfolding, right? And I always like to make the parallelisms between the two, because neither ICAO CORSIA nor the aggregate of the commitment of countries in the Paris Agreement is actually in alignment with the temperature goals that we are all striving to achieve to avoid climate change. So, but in both cases, there's what we call the ratchet mechanism to ensure that the lack of ambition can be transformed into ever increasing ambition over time. So we have that in the Paris Agreement, and we have that also in ICAO CORSIA, which is wonderful. So every 3 years, there's the possibility to actually ratchet, increase the ambition of CORSIA. That's not going to happen like that overnight. Things are very complex. Dr. Schneider gave us some insights about the big discussions about the baseline change that has a big impact on that. But having said that, there's also very important negotiations taking place as we speak, and actually missing one of those negotiations right now because I wanted to be here with you, and that's on the long-term aspirational goal. So basically, we are sitting together, putting lots of brains together to work on defining a long-term goal for ICAO, for international aviation. And that could be, obviously my organization, Environmental Defense Fund. We are pushing for net zero climate impact by 2050. And it could actually be achieved. And we work extremely hard on the different mitigation opportunities that are available to aviation to deliver and make a contribution in the fight against climate change. And you might ask yourself, is that really possible? Let's come back to that later. Okay, so, but having said that, so we have the lack of ambition right now, basically levels here, 2020 carbon neutral growth, but we will have a stringent cap by 2050 or 2060. And at some point we have to do the connection between the two and make a downward trajectory that links the two things. And that's where we are engaged on. So in 2022, at the next General Assembly, we will have hopefully the opportunity to reach an agreement on what is the decarbonization goal for aviation and how to link that with the current ambition. And that's where, where the parallelism with the Paris Agreement takes even bigger force, if you want. So I think that's important to say that. There's another important element here is that, the agreement that we have reflects not only that ambition, but also, it has lots of other great things. I mean, the most important thing from my perspective is that we have an MRV system, a monitoring, verification and reporting system that applies across the board, even for airlines that whose emissions are not covered because the country, the countries where they operate is not covered or doesn't have an obligation under CORSIA. All airlines around the world have the obligation to report their emissions. And that's a milestone. And that's the foundation to build something even bigger out of this. And to, it is basically the foundation to the goal at hand. And that's, I think that we gotta be extremely proud of what has been achieved in the context of ICAO, given the circumstances, because it's the first global sectoral approach and is, lacking ambition is still extremely important for the world. There's lots of uncertainty, notably when it comes to the CO2 emissions, to the offsets and so on. The pandemic didn't help in any way with the change of the baseline for the first 3 years. We're still fighting extremely hard for that not to be extended beyond that point. So we will get into on a pathway that makes a lot of sense, hopefully. But as it was mentioned before, a lot of this uncertainty is actually coming from the lack of agreement in the UNFCCC on Article 6. So once that is solved, we will have more certainty about what is going to happen with ICAO CORSIA. I've been, as I said, working extremely hard on CORSIA matters for many, many years. We're always on the line. Everything can be wrong or everything can go right. And we're still there. The eligibility of the units that are currently eligible, the programs that are eligible currently for ICAO CORSIA are eligible only for the pilot testing phase for 2021, 22, and 23. So if we get strong rules in UNFCCC with the Paris Agreement on Article 6, and we have a change of gears there in global ambition, we can actually get something when it comes to the offsets that will have high integrity and high impact. So I'm convinced of that. And I'm convinced of that also because we need offsets. Offsets is probably not the only way forward. We all agree on that, but aviation, for what was mentioned before about the non-CO2 effects, there's always going to be, for whatever we do, changing the flight conditions, the operations, or if we use alternative fuels that have a lower, that burn cleaner and that have a lower impact in terms of non-CO2 effects, we are always going to have non-CO2 effects. And the effective radiated forcing of aviation is not just CO2, as was mentioned before, is much bigger. So we are still going to have to compensate for that impact. That's going to come first with offsets, and then within offsets, a subcategory of offsets, which is removals, when there's nothing else to offset, right? But that's part of the equation. That's why also the work that has been done in ICAO is critical, because it lays the foundation for that to happen and unfold in the right direction. Now, changing gears back to what I wanted to share with you is that, in ICAO, airlines have two options to comply with CORSIA offsetting obligations. They can either use the offsets that were mentioned before or sustainable aviation fuels. And it's not just sustainable aviation fuels. Actually, airlines will report emissions from combustion when they use sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels, or e-fuels. They will report them just the same as they do with fossil fuels. And then they will actually, there's a whole process, a full methodology that is really full-fledged and it's pretty incredible. It's a huge accomplishment and a contribution by ICAO over the last 7 years. So they develop a full methodology to estimate emissions reductions from the use of sustainable aviation fuel. That is made on a life cycle basis to ensure that the emission reductions are real and accounting for leakage, which in the context of biofuels, for instance, is mostly driven by indirect land use change emissions. So these are really great major accomplishment and contributions from ICAO. And it was mentioned before that, yeah, but the carbon price signal that will be revealed in ICAO might not be enough. I mean, certainly will not be enough to trigger a fuel switch, right? And we all agree on that. But and that's where I wanted to share with you some of the insights and the thinking that we've been making and how things are actually evolving in some parts of the world, where we are actually envisioning, this work in ICAO or the EU ETS as the flagship, carbon market. I mean, the policy, the flagship policy. And on top of that, there's a number of complementary policies that help bring down the abatement cost. So it is the combination of those complementary policies with the carbon price signal that we have in the EU ETS right now, around 50 euros per ton of CO2, that actually will drive the deployment of these fuels. There are two very interesting cases already. In the United States of America, we have a number of economic incentives that are already available to airlines, including the renewable fuel standard at the federal level. We have in California, we have the low carbon fuel standard, and also direct subsidies like tax credits, that's how they call it. Every time, all those are actually incredible amount of money. We're talking about 300, 400 euros per ton of abatement in incentives. And if on top of that, you add another 50 or 30 coming from either corporate customers or airlines because they have an incentive to do so under the EU ETS or in the United States under CORSIA or future policy framework, basically that's what changes the equation. That's where you say, oh, wow, you have these complementary policies that make the price go down, just as was the case with feed-in tariffs for renewable electricity production in some countries. Not all of them implemented that in the same way, but there's some parallelism there too, where you bring down the cost and those technologies still take the marginal price signal, in the case, for instance, of electricity in the wholesale electricity markets. Depends by country, as I said, but in some countries, there were arrangements where there were subsidies combined with the market incentives. And so all that changes the way we look into this, and the fact that sustainable aviation fuels are called to be the enabling technology to decarbonize aviation, and also to address partially some of the non-CO2 effects of aviation. So, and that's where we are actually engaged, not only in the United States, but also in Europe very strongly to create that environment where this kind of policy, where the policy actually helps deliver that outcome. But for that to happen, we need, for instance, in the context of the context of the European Union, we need a key ingredient, which is to change the way the EU ETS accounts for the use of biomaterials, of bioenergy in general, where since the old days, everything according to Annex 4, everything that is biogenic by origin, it can claim zero combustion emissions, zero CO2 combustion emissions, which is basically the same thing in this case because of coverage of gases. So, and that's actually, interestingly, that's the paradigm shift that took place in ICAO in collaboration, and that's the collaboration of the environmental community, the United States, and Europe. Europe heavily involved with the European Commission and member states, a fundamental role of Europe making this happen, and to ensure that any claim towards a GHG regulation, anything that has to do with a cap or an offsetting mechanism that where you have obligations, you can only claim emissions reductions that really are associated with the fuel that you're using. So you're not claiming zero if you're using something that actually on a life cycle basis is 6 times worse than fossil fuel. And we have that. That's palm oil, depending on composition of, if you destroy 70% rainforest and 25% drain peatland, you get something like 6 times worse than fossil fuel. And it's like, oh, wow, that's the paradigm shift that is required in the EU ETS accounting rules to ensure that these fuels are rewarded on a performance basis. And that way we actually ensure that we preserve the EU ETS integrity, because every time somebody claims zero combustion emissions and emissions are going up somewhere else in the world, that's really serious. And we're not talking about minor things. Over a decade, we're talking the combination. I did the calculation the other day, combine the case of the European Union and the United States, in that case with corn ethanol and also soy. The combination of the two countries over 10 years, the impact is 1 gigaton of CO2 that has been released in terms of as a result of deforestation. And that's the lower bound. If you can actually, probably the number is actually several times that one, but that's like using the numbers that the kind of moderate numbers. And 1 gigatons of CO2 as a result of that is only accounting for the negative impact in the atmosphere, but it's not accounting for the destruction of the ecosystems. It's not accounting for the fact that livelihoods have been destroyed, and all that has to be taken into account. And ICAO did. Interestingly, ICAO took the leadership to define the sustainability criteria for these kind of fuels to ensure that those negative impacts don't happen. They're still working on the final ruling. Hopefully we will have a final approved by a UN agency by the end of the year, which is really promising. And I think we gotta be extremely grateful to the work ICAO has been doing, because has been breaking ground there. A quick connection with the EU ETS, I know. Oh,
wrap up now?
Okay, I wrap up very quickly. 2 ideas. The first one is that the complementary policy and the EU ETS prices, they will all fill up the gap premium, but the EU ETS price is meant to increase, and which means that at some point, only the EU ETS price signal will be enough to incentivize the uptake of SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to share very quickly is the emergence of parallel voluntary markets too, where corporate customers get heavily involved in this. We set up very quickly, very recently we launched Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance with corporate customers willing to use sustainable aviation fuels, ready to pay for the premium gap to actually be able to claim emission reductions towards their voluntary targets. That's wonderful, because that's actually the parallelism, and I'm using too much that word, but there's a lot of parallelism with what happened with other markets, because we're just talking about the same thing. We're just talking about mitigation opportunities. In this case, the advantage is that those happen on the supply chain of aviation, which is wonderful. Yeah, but I think I'm going to stop there and reserve for questions. Thank you. I'm sorry it took longer.
Thank you, Pedro, and thanks to all three speakers. Very informative. I'd like to again make the plea for people to put their questions in the Q&A box. We already have one question up from Leonard Keller about addressed to Lambert Schneider, but equally could be addressed, and I'll address it to all three. So Lambert, you mentioned the 2022 review of CORSIA. What are the prospects there? And what potential do you see in CORSIA in the longer term, and what's necessary? I think you've touched upon that in a bit of your presentation, but let's hear your opinion, but also from Juan Carlos and Pedro. But start with Lambert.
Yeah, thank you. I thought the same, that Pedro and Juan Carlos are much better in a position to answer that question. But I mean, I'm not in the ICAO negotiations. I mean, it's more from seeing what's necessary. So I think the point Pedro made about a climate neutral 2050 target and having a trajectory to get there, that's a key issue. So also expanding to non-CO2 means climate neutral, right? And yeah, having interim goals that are aligned with that, I think that would be important. And I think, and I'm also curious what Juan Carlos and Pedro think about it. I think it would be useful to have some in-sector goal, right? Or at least a pathway or policies to say, okay, this is, I mean, certainly a part we will do through offsetting, but also thinking, how can we reduce emissions within the sector?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we have to bear in mind is that CORSIA only deals with the offsetting of the emissions that represent a growth over a certain baseline. So it's not dealing with the emissions that may be associated with the operations on the ground or the operations in terms of the flights, and it's not dealing with the emissions that may be associated with the aircraft characteristics, which is why I start my presentation with these like three potential parts of what is conditioning or what is driving the emissions for the aviation industry. So CORSIA only deals with a small bit of everything that needs to be improved in the aviation industry to really limit and reduce significantly the emissions from that activity. So in this small remit of CORSIA of dealing with the growth of the emissions and compensating for them, also what we have is different phases. By when something needs to happen in the CORSIA world. So by 2022, from my personal, and this is not TAB related position or anything, I have to be clear, is my own interpretation of things. I guess that there will be some discussions about the baseline, because the main change that happened now, and because of the COVID and all of that, is a change in the baseline, and that dramatically shift the potential ambition of the compensation. Of course, now, I don't know to say, we can celebrate a reduction of the activity from the point of view of the emissions, but it's not that we want just to get rid of economic activity all over the place, all over the world, for the sake of the emissions. So CORSIA is dealing with that growth. So ideally, there will be a review of the baseline. There will be a decision on whether what exists is the best way to compensate for that, and there will be some type of adjustment in the numbers, because we do not know yet what will be the rebound in terms of the activity in the aviation sector. How much people after a year and a half or 2 years stuck at home may want to fly somewhere. I mean, we know that there are flights that takes you nowhere but back to the same airport, and people having dining experiences in aircrafts. So humanity is a little bit crazy sometimes. So hopefully that's what will happen, ideally. I don't know, Pedro Pires.
Yeah, the advantage of having two Pedros here. I already shared my thoughts on this question, but I want to say something that from a political perspective, I see it very hard for policymakers at the General Assembly to agree or attempt to agree on a long-term goal, and at the same time relaxing the changing the rules for the baseline to make, to keep the change that they approved only for the pilot phase. I think that if we are serious, if ICAO is serious about climate change and fighting, involved in this discussion, they will actually have to keep the 2019-2020 baseline and build on that. And that's not going to help us like tightening it any further in 2022, but it's already making sure that at least we live up to what we agreed at the time. And as Lambert said, roughly it's the same depending on how the rebound is, but there's the big chance that if we use that, we actually roughly on the same thing, on the same size of the requirements. So I see that happening, keeping the original baseline, because otherwise the signal will be horrible. Will be like, we don't care about climate change. I don't think they will risk that. On top of that, I also see, or I will actually pursue personally, bilateral agreements between countries. There are different ways to increase ambition in a way that is compatible both with the CAO Convention and the ICAO resolution that has some provisions about the only carbon market, the only market-based measures and so on. Too much into the weeds we need to go. But the thing is that, two jurisdictions like the European Union and the United States of America, they can on bilateral basis, they can agree to increase the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels for the routes connecting the two continents. I mean, the two jurisdictions. That would actually be on top of what is going on with CORSIA. That is something similar that we see when it comes to the coexistence of CORSIA and the EU ETS. There's one option, which is there's coexistence between the two. Let's make sure that that doesn't result in a decrease in ambition of the EU ETS. And you can do that very easily. And I think we're heading there, where you actually have these sustainable aviation fuel obligations that actually will fill up the requirements under CORSIA, which is because sustainable aviation fuel is the common currency between the two systems. And if you meet CORSIA obligations using sustainable aviation fuel, you're all set in terms of like, you're not, for those intra-European flights, you are not filing a difference. That's jargon from the international law in ICAO, but basically you don't need to break the rule and say, oh, I'm not going to apply this to the international flights connecting Madrid and Paris, for instance. That's an international flight from CORSIA perspective. And if we want to keep a seat at the ICAO Council, and rather than 7 or 8 seats that we have as Europe, sorry, I'm talking like European now, I shouldn't, we gotta meet fulfill those requirements, and also avoiding filling up a difference and diverting from the application or the implementation of CORSIA. We avoid other countries to do the same for bad reasons. We Europeans would say, oh, we do this to increase the ambition, the environmental ambition of this, but other countries would actually might do the same thing, but for the opposite, with the opposite outcome. So there's room for improvement, and there's a lot of room for bilateral action to increase the ambition of CORSIA. And that's actually very much in line to what, Pedro, you mentioned before, the CBDR concept, the CBDR principle, or it was you, Lambert, I don't remember anymore. And it's like, you can actually add this component by increasing ambition on a bilateral basis. Back to you.
But maybe also just to complement that, I guess that the big push could come from the extended or more extended use of sustainable aviation fuels. If countries, airlines, and ICAO want to be more ambitious, if it's not limiting the growth because of the number of operations, it's about the type of fuel that is being consumed or used in the industry. And there are some, I would say, significant progress on that. And people in the sector know that these may represent 10-15% additional reduction compared to existing use of fossil fuels. So in terms of becoming more ambitious, that could be potentially a good push in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
I think.
As I said before, we can fully decarbonize aviation using SAF, including biofuels and e-fuels, if done properly. And ICAO set the stage on how to do it. we can definitely do it.
I'm almost tempted to say memo to the European Commission, please check the sustainable biofuels criteria of ICAO, which I would say is quite a change from usually who would
I know.
advocating for the memo to be sent to. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like us to gauge on. One of them would be, a few years ago, for those who are old enough to remember the debate, the EU pushed the inclusion of aviation, including international aviation, into the EU ETS. So after all these years, and after the so-called stop the clock decision on international aviation, etc., do we have any evidence, put it this way, of any substantial impact of that inclusion of domestic flights, put it this way, onto the industry, onto European emissions? So kind of, is there an assessment that has been made of how well that inclusion has been done? Then there is something that I'm particularly keen to hear your views on, because I'm facing that debate in a particular context, which is how do you feel, how do you consider, how do you assess industry claims for net zero goals, i.e. industry claiming, we're going to be net zero by, let's say, 2025, for example, and I'm talking here even aviation companies, and obviously on the back of substantial amount of offsetting, because there's no significant use of SAF. There's CORSIA itself is not working. So how do you assess these claims in terms of their, let's say, credibility? And within that discussion, the fact that there is a strong push, and I think, Lambert, you mentioned, strong push for using removal units rather than reduction units. And so for our audience, essentially investing in things like afforestation or reforestation, etc., tropical forest conservation, as opposed to investing in renewables or investing in other types of projects always within offsets. So your views on that, and we have also an attendee that has a lengthy question, but essentially financial crises have led to restructuring of many companies. Insolvency rules are not harmonized, and there are no rules under the EU ETS that says anything about whether emissions debt can be relieved as part of a restructuring process, which I'm not sure that is fully correct. But this disharmony between the absolute obligation to surrender allowances and the national rules on how to save companies could lead to different practice among different nations and a sort of carbon leakage. I guess this has to do with closure versus new entrant rules under the EU ETS. Does anyone know whether this is likely to be cleared up within the EU? And I'm guessing that perhaps Lambert, you may know a little bit more about this than others. But on all these questions, please go ahead. Let's start again with Lambert and then go through Juan Carlos and Pedro. So Lambert.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I can answer actually all these questions, but I will start with those maybe where I can give a little bit of impact. I think, yeah, the claims by companies, and I think there was also a question about the quality and how the future market could develop. I think in the market, there's a broad recognition that the quality of carbon credits on the market really varies. That there are some poor quality credits and some higher quality and some middle quality credits. And what's actually high quality, it's difficult and and everybody has struggled with that. And the reason is that there are really many different aspects you need to ensure to have high quality. And if one is bad, maybe then is very bad, then the whole carbon credit is bad, right? But maybe some carbon credits are good on some aspects and bad on other aspects, etc. And so And therefore, I think it's also hard to judge some of the net zero claims, which basically rely mostly on offsets, at least for the airline industry, right? But I think there are various initiatives underway who try to kind of narrow and define what high quality makes. And we are involved with EDF and WWF in one of these initiatives. There's the Carney initiative, which was mentioned. They try to define core carbon principles and set also kind of a minimum bar or minimum level playing field of what constitutes a reasonable quality. And there are another more initiatives out there where people try to kind of assess the quality of carbon credits and grade them. And so I think the positive moment in the market is that there's a lot of recognition that quality is an issue and it should improve. And the other interesting related debate is the debate, and that's a big debate on its own. It's around this double counting or double claiming, given that under the Paris Agreement, all countries have NDC targets. Is it a risk if the same emission reduction is claimed by the country where the project takes place and by the airline, right? And ICAO made clear this needs to be avoided through Article 6 rules, through corresponding adjustments. But in the voluntary carbon market, there's a big debate and a big controversy about this, where Gold Standard moves forward and says, no, we don't want this type of double counting if you want carbon neutrality claims. But others say, like Vera, as long as you are transparent and you are saying you are not moving beyond the NDC, but you're helping a country to achieve its NDC, it's still fine, right? So there's a very big, it's a topic on its own for an own webinar, I guess, but there's this very big about the need in the voluntary market to avoid double claiming. And I think how the future market develops, that was one of the questions, really depends on these matters. It also depends kind of on the vintage rules, whether you allow old credits to come into the market, which could lead to sustained low prices, etc., or whether you have a market where, in particular, ICAO at some point says, okay, now from 2024 onwards, we only want new projects, right? We want new mitigation to happen, as an example. And that could really shape the market, the price, but also the type of units which are eligible and the emissions impact this will have. Then last point I want to make about the removals and reductions. And I think Pedro made the point, like in the very long term, we can only have removals as offsets, right? If we are at net zero emissions, there's no room to have offsets by avoiding emissions. But I think it's a quite long way to go there. And I think there are some high quality credits which reduce emissions. And although it should be the long-term perspective, I'm not sure that it's reasonable at this stage to only focus on removal for various reasons, because many removals, at least in the forestry sector, they also have non-permanence risks. And if we can avoid emission reductions which are quite permanent, or where we are quite sure that they are permanent, that's better, I would say. Then if we keep fossil fuels in the ground, it's better than doing afforestation, at least from a permanence perspective. And so that's also something to be in mind in that context. Thank you.
And maybe related to that is part of the discussion on the importance of removals is that permanence time frame, which is a little bit what Dr. Schneider you were mentioning a moment ago. And within the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, the notion of, well, maybe forest and forestry related activities may give us permanence in the sense of decades, or maybe 100 years or so. But then there are people saying, well, but the capturing and storaging of the CO2 underground may give us centuries in terms of the permanence. Of course, there are plenty of technical aspects on all of these, no? But I guess that the important point here is that removals are increasingly becoming the potential way forward in terms of the thinking or the rationale of what will support your claim for a net zero type of target if you are a corporation, no? That you move way or away from the avoidance towards the actual decrease of your emissions, which is your own action, but also removing from the atmosphere what you have emitted on the past and you're still emitting right now. So to actually achieve the net zero type of claim that you are making. And one of the aspects of this is, and I highlighted that in my presentation, that's why I added that slide, is the difficulty for governments and also for the standards to talk to each other and maintain this level of communication that allows everyone to avoid the double claiming, the double counting, the double issuance, and the double use of emission reductions. For those who have applied to become eligible under CORSIA, one of the things that they have to demonstrate in terms of having measures or procedures in place in their documents, that it's physically there, is that they have a way to deal with informing or communicating with the host government of that mitigation activity, that the government knows that the activity is taking place in that jurisdiction, that the activity will generate or is generating some emission reductions in the form of credits, and that those credits may potentially be used for certain use, in this case, for the aviation sector. So what it sees right now is that not many of the existing standards, even those that we all know very well, have already those measures in place, because this is something relatively new. The competing uses for these emission reductions, and everyone trying to find a way on how to deal with this. We see gold standard with its own position, as well as VERA for VCS, in terms of how to deal with that. But what is important is that it is up to the standards and it's up to the governments to maintain that clear communication in terms of everyone knowing what the mitigation activity is, what it will create or generate, what issuance exists around that activity, and what is the final use of that credit. If it's a removal or avoidance or reduction, that's a different discussion, but that everyone knows that. So transparency is paramount in the whole process, and not just for the claiming, but also for CORSIA and also for the NDCs and also for Article 6. So is everything intertwined? But just to say that governments have a very important role, and governments are the ones who have to adjust their level of emissions, the corresponding adjustments. And it's up to the standards who are creating these units out of something which is their own standard, their own program, for them to facilitate that anyone who participates in these markets can have that level of transparency. Otherwise, the quality of the credits may be at stake, just to start with that component.
Thank you. Pedro.
Yeah, I have half an hour, right? And just kidding. So some people might think that my favorite word is parallelism, but it's not. It's actually a word that Juan Carlos just mentioned, is transparency. Transparency and transparency, that's what we need. We have exactly the same issues when it comes to offsets or removals. The same issues can emerge when, in the case of sustainable aviation fuels. And transparency is the key word here. Once we have that in place and mechanisms to ensure that countries know what is going on in their backyard, and that the claims are made with a pace that helps country report, in the case of, for instance, international aviation, that the sustainable aviation fuel has been used for international purposes, and they put that into the international bunker bucket rather than elsewhere. Once you have that, boom, life is easy. So we work extremely hard. We're still working extremely hard to get these fixed, and not fixed, we are changing the way we do business as a society, right? And we are facing new challenges. And this is one of the challenges that we are working on, but we already have, because we had the opportunity to set up our own MRV system. What ICAO did with SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, is to set up its own program. So we have our own program with, to generate emission reductions and to certify them. There's a standard, there's the whole traceability system. So there are, actually we use an umbrella standard, and we use, the standard owner then actually hires certification body that will send auditors to ensure that everybody on the supply chain is actually doing the right thing, and the traceability is respected, and the claims have integrity. So one of the things that we did in this system, I had the privilege to hold the pen to write that down. That was a rare privilege for the environmental NGO community. We added a requirement to ensure that the communication between these programs, the communication with the members, with the countries, does exist. We're still refining and providing the guidance, But we anticipated that as a necessary element to enhance the transparency of the system, and it's really cool. Lots of that's why I get excited about what the work ICAO does, because we are breaking the ground on so many things that are important, even though we have to improve lots of things. We all agree on that. I want to touch upon one of the questions that you raised before, Pedro, the one on credibility, with airlines making big claims. For instance, United Airlines, they made a big claim about net zero by 2050, and the credibility of that claim is, who knows, because you don't even know what is behind the mind of these companies. But we know the policy environment where they operate, and because we cross then also in Congress in the US and in the Hill, and so we know what they're pushing for and the kind of things that they are seeing happening. And there are sufficient incentives right now, and there will be more, to make that energy transition a reality, notably when it comes to the use of sustainable aviation fuels. Right now, with the existing incentives in the United States of America, we're just talking about a premium gap of in California of around 50 euros per ton of CO2 in abatement cost. When the real cost is, the full cost would be 300. If you already take advantage of all the different existing supported schemes, and airlines are entitled to do so, basically they just need to fill up a gap of, say, $50 per ton of CO2 in abatement. That might shrink even further. And then when you add ICAO CORSIA, whatever the price signal is, that will actually make it shrink even more. And that's really cool. That's what changes everything. And when you get corporate customers and end consumers engage in that and say, oh, I have certitude that the mitigation opportunities that this airline is providing actually have integrity, both in terms of the sustainability framework, but also the transparency that we're talking about to avoid double counting in general, double claiming in particular, is critical. Once you have that environment set up, wow, you can trigger this transition, and it's going to happen very quickly because the economic incentives are already there. So I do give credibility to the claims. We need to steer their engagement to ensure that results in real emissions reductions, but it can happen. So on a very positive note, I want to leave it there. Thank you. Pedro froze. Pedro, if you are talking, we cannot hear you. So.
Well, I don't know if anyone has any other question, or Michael.
No, and Benjamin was coming in as well. If Pedro is indeed disconnected, I think I'll take over and close for him unless he comes back, because I've been organizing these sessions in the past. I know all three of you, and I'm thrilled that you were able to join. I think Pedro already thanked you. Your capabilities, qualifications, competences to speak about the topic obviously were beyond any doubt, but you proved it again. And thanks also for going beyond the originally agreed time, so beyond and above the call of duty, which is good. Even though we lost some participants in the last half hour because we went over time, this will be recorded and it will be made available on the ICAP website. And I'm sure that many will still find this useful going forward. So since Pedro seems to not be able to join us again, I'll just go ahead and round out. Thanks for everything. Thanks for giving us critical views and reminding us of the challenges facing, decarbonization in the aviation sector, but also towards the end, especially some of the promising signs and some of the opportunities going forward. You'll see in the chat that there's links to the website where the recording will be uploaded, where the presentation documents will be uploaded, and where also reminder of the next installment in this webinar session will be coming up. And yeah, I look forward to talking to many of you in different settings, and of course also to the next installment in a month's time. Thank you very much again. Stay safe, be well, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.